Violence against children can occur in many settings, including homes, schools, alternative care arrangements, religious institutions, prisons, hospitals, refugee camps, and on the street. When a conflict or a disaster occurs, children are at increased risk of being subjected to violence by family and community members, and by other groups or individuals. In addition, other risk factors may arise, such as less available parents and caregivers, distress within the family, and separation from friends and family. It is important to understand that these special risks can compromise children's healthy development and psychosocial well-being. Children's ability to cope with challenges, their resilience, becomes more important when there is a disaster or a conflict situation. This is explored in more detail towards the end of this module. The impact of crisis events and difficult circumstances on young people's development and well-being depends on multiple factors, such as the nature and duration of the event, whether it is an ongoing conflict or a crisis event like an earthquake, typhoon, or tsunami, whether the crisis is perceived by the person as life-threatening, the effect and severity of the crisis, including whether the child has suffered physical injuries, lost loved ones, or witnessed injury, abduction, death, or other frightening events, the child's psychosocial well-being prior to the crisis, and his or her ability to cope, the presence of and access to a functioning child protection system, the resources and capabilities of families to meet the child's needs, as well as the parents' or caregivers' own well-being prior to and during the crisis. In times of crisis, children are particularly vulnerable due to their age, size, stage of development, and dependency on adults. Children therefore need extra support and protection. Children's vulnerability is increased in the immediate aftermath of a disaster or a sudden conflict. In the chaos that follows, children may be lost and separated, moved from family to family, or hospital to hospital, placing them at a much greater risk of abuse of all kinds. In times of crisis, whether it is within a family or the community or at the level of the whole country, threats may increase and include emotional abuse, physical abuse, including family violence, sexual abuse, including rape and other forms of sexual exploitation, commercial exploitation, such as child labor, school dropout, increased level of harmful practices, including harmful coping mechanisms such as child marriage or removal from school, trafficking or abduction for labor or sex, recruitment into armed forces or groups, maiming, injuries or death, family separation, detention, forced migration. Although all children live with some risk of experiencing violence and other threats, some children are more vulnerable to risks than others and are in special need of support and protection. Some groups of children who are particularly vulnerable to risks include children who are separated from their families or usual caregivers, unaccompanied and separated children, children living with disabilities, children associated with armed forces and armed groups, CAAFAG, children living in institutions such as orphanages, children, adolescents, and youth exposed to discrimination or marginalization, for example, because of their belonging to a minority group or their sexual orientation, children coming from economically vulnerable backgrounds. Girls are commonly more at risk of sexual violence. Adolescents who sometimes are seen as old enough to be able to care for themselves, and therefore may not receive care from adults. Young people who are particularly vulnerable to risks may need extra protection and support, but care is also needed not to reinforce stigma or perceptions of difference.